Learning Norwegian feels so much harder than learning English. Speaking Norwegian feels so much harder, so much more tedious, so much more frustrating than speaking English. And this is, of course, for you who are not native speakers of English. Because I know there are many people who have learned English previously as a second language and now are learning Norwegian, and it feels different. I get this feedback so often. People tell me this with regard to Norwegian and also with regards to German, that I did English maybe at high school, maybe on my own. It went well. I mean, learning a language is always a time investment, right? It's always a commitment, but it went well. I got my results, I made a progression, but now I'm learning Norwegian or German, yeah, and I'm struggling badly. And I really feel that I want to address this because I know some things that I think might help you. It would be really bad not to know about this. Reason number one why this can be so for many students is that our motivation is ultimately different. We often say, like, I am really motivated to learn Norwegian. I feel like I really have to learn Norwegian. I really want to finally learn to speak Norwegian, right? We say all these things, but in reality, sometimes, not every time, but sometimes our inner motivation deep down is a little different. Sometimes we're a bit like, I know I have to, but I don't feel like that. Sometimes we like English better. Sometimes at our workplace, we use a lot of English and not so much Norwegian. And we would love to learn Norwegian, have more natural access to the culture, to other people and everything. But there is no real core need, right? In the same way, if you didn't speak English, you wouldn't have a chance, right? If you don't speak Norwegian, you do have a chance. Maybe you have a good job, right? Maybe you have a partner who speaks English with you, or maybe none of you speak Norwegian as your first language, right? Your situation might be whatever, but English is something all of us like really need in today's world. It's a global language, and we are really hard to go about as an expat and not speak English in this part of the world. Yeah, so the motivation is very true. And also, there are a lot of things that we might be interested in. We want to consume sources about them, we want to listen and read about them. And English is the language of technology, it's the language of science nowadays, it's the language of cutting edge progress in any field. Yeah, so if we're interested in these hot news, we can read it for the first time in English and only later in a translation. And of course, nowadays we have good software that can help us get that translation immediately. But if we do that, then we will probably go and translate into our first language rather than into Norwegian. So there is this thing with motivation. When we want to listen to Norwegian sources, we have to prioritize that. And I find myself sometimes prioritizing English sources over Norwegian sources because the stuff I'm the most interested in the way I'm interested in it, yeah, the most innovative way maybe, or the best speaker on that topic, that's usually in English. Also, Norwegian YouTubers very often have English channels. I want to listen to this, I want to learn about this topic, but if I am to do that in Norwegian, I'm gonna spend much more time searching for it, and I will probably not find a source of the same quality because there is just too little. Yeah, there is so much more in English. And why am I talking about sources? Because this thing of this point of being interested in what's in that source, that's my motivation, isn't it? If I really, really want to read about this topic and it's only available in Norwegian, then this will motivate me, right? The need to read about it or to listen about it will motivate me to reach for that source. And by consuming that source, I'm gonna learn a lot of real life language, a lot of Norwegian. We ultimately learn through listening and through reading. That's what I always say. I think you've gotten used to it by now if you follow me for some time. And if the source is really what we need, in terms of contents, then we will put up with the form and we will consume the form as well, and we will learn. But if I want to learn something about gardening, yeah, for example, then it's so easy to get a really good source in English, and it's so hard to get a source of the same quality in Norwegian. There is just too little. And we can go over to the second point, which is sources. I have started to speak about it now. So the motivation was your true motivation, and your motivation through the sources. Like, is this source of the language motivating enough for you? Do you really want it? Or do you just want to learn the language, and that's the only reason why you are consuming this source? Sources in general, it's quite hard to find good sources of Norwegian. I mean, there is enough, there is a lot. But if you compare with English, which is a big language, you have a lot of offer, and also free offer for language learners. So you can go from day one, you can find easy readers, you can find audiobooks that are made to easy readers. You have all this level grading available. And in Norwegian, there is quite little. There are some easy readers, but the best edition of easy readers in Norwegian is actually aimed at children, so it's not such a great thing to motivate adults. And there is this easy reader by Ollie Richards called Short Stories in Norwegian. I recommend that. It's for A2 B1. It's good, even though there are some mistakes in the story, so it's a bit like, okay, it's Norwegian, but there are a few grammatical mistakes in there, which is a little stupid. But it's, I would say that's by far the best easy reader on the market, because the stories are engaging. So you can try that, but that's about it. I mean, there is a bit more, yes, but if you compare with English, again, oh my God, such a difference in the selection of both paid and free sources that would fit your level. And also high level sources like podcasts or YouTube channels, like I was talking about. There is so much more in English. And if you want to learn about the things that you want to learn about anyway, like maybe motivation, lifestyle aspects, or productivity. So sometimes we have to push ourselves a little bit to maybe reach for that Norwegian translation of the English bestseller, so that we create the artificial need to read it in Norwegian. And I know about this because I am on YouTube a lot, and I am around in the podcast world a lot, looking for sources for my students, for my courses, and for my private students, because I always offer sources to consume to students. Because if I just explain the grammar, or I just explain the difference between this word and that word, that's cool. That's what students come for as well. But if you don't have the modeling, you don't have the sources, you don't listen enough, then this is not going to help you that much. It's limited. Yeah, the explanation a teacher can give you is really valuable, but it's limited if you don't underlie it, if you don't base it on loads of listening. So I always offer these, and that's why I spend a lot of time searching for like good sources that are pertinent to that particular level and that particular topic. And I know this is a bit of struggle. I do the same with English sources because I also teach English, and it's so much easier, right? And we have also motivational tools like Youglish, which is a tool for searching phrases and YouTube videos so that you can listen for your phrase in multiple contexts. What do you think? Do they have support for Norwegian videos? No, they don't. Of course not, because it's such a small language. So all of these brilliant options and brilliant tools and brilliant sources, they exist for English. They don't exist for Norwegian, or if they exist, the selection is very, very limited. If there is a source in Norwegian about a topic that you might be interested in, you can bet that there is a better source, 10 times as many in English, right? So we need to go back to our motivation, inner motivation. What is it I like about Norwegian? What is it that really makes me need it and really want it, if it is so? And then pretend that the English source isn't there and take the translation, for example. And now a very, very important point that I think we tend to forget about a little bit in this sense, and that's the grammar. Because speaking is not so much about grammar as we sometimes feel after sitting through a course. But if we are learning using that school method of learning, which means doing the grammar, doing the vocabulary list, trying to put it together, then it doesn't work and we get frustrated. If we do something like this, then our results, like how far this substandard method is going to take us, that really depends on how hard the grammar in the language is. And that's the struggle. We just say that, oh, Norwegian has harder grammar, which means that you have to practice the grammar for longer, right? No, it's not that straightforward. You can practice that grammar forever and it still won't translate into natural speaking, right? It's not about practicing the grammar in terms of grammar exercises more and more and more. That gives you better understanding, but really the speaking is always about recycling your input, recycling what you have read and listened. So really what these exercises do to you, if they move you somewhere, is that they give you model sentences. Yeah, it's not about the filling, it's about seeing the model sentence and then being able to pick some of them and to repeat them when it's pertinent. So this is how grammar exercises can help you to speak better, because they are a bit like reading, aren't they? They do provide some input, some modeling, but the filling in the gaps, that helps you understand better, that doesn't help you speak better. And that's the struggle. We think that if we only fill in more of those exercises, then we'll be able to use this grammar in speaking. But no, it's not how it works. And I think many of you have seen that, like you fill exercises in like crazy, and where is the natural speaking when your neighbor shows up and asks you something? So if we take a language like English, which has, let's say, relatively simple grammar. I don't like dividing grammar from vocabulary like that because it's a little complicated. If we look at, for example, the beining, yeah, changing the word forms, you don't have that in English. Yeah. If we look at all these struggles with possessives in front and behind and sin and hans and things like that, you don't have that in English, and so on. So arguably English grammar is a bit more simple for students because English is very heavily phrase based. If you are learning English, you can't avoid learning phrases, and even old-fashioned textbooks show you the phrases because there are a lot of expressions in English that work like that. Yeah, so I would say that English is a heavily phrase-based language by its nature. It does have a lot of systematic grammar, and it is a Germanic language originally, even though it has a lot from French from later on. But it is somehow easier to learn some grammar, learn some vocabulary, learn those phrases, and if you put it together, it will take you somewhere. It won't take you to full fluency. Yeah. For full fluency, you still need input, you need the opportunity to be recycling what you have heard. And if you consume a lot of those sources, if you watch the whole content on a big YouTube channel in English, that is what lifts your English and what lifts your ability to just spit it out without thinking, because you are repeating what you have heard before. And the grammar explanations, those help you understand what's going on and open you for understanding and taking in more of that input. So, but when the grammar is a little bit more simple, like in English, and there is more focus on the phrase level, this is going to be easier. In a language like Norwegian or German, which I would say has even more complicated grammar with cases and things like that than Norwegian does, this is very, very hard because basically, if you are doing grammar plus words equal sentences, this kind of thinking, then you can't even ask where the toilet is without applying complicated grammar rules on words. And that's a problem. Even like asking where the toilet is, you need to get into like bestemt form, and you need to realize, toilet, which gender is it, right? And then put the right ending on it and create all these things. And in the end, you rather just hold it and go at home, right? Because you were not able to ask. correctly. And this brings me to the core, I feel, of the problem, why it is much more difficult for students to learn to speak Norwegian or German in comparison with English. It's because many language courses give out the impression that grammar plus vocabulary equals speaking. And when the grammar starts being complicated, like in Norwegian, like in German, then this just brings you nowhere at all. You learn some phrases like god natt, takk for sist, and so on, and those are no problem, right? You can use them naturally. But once you get into things like bestemt form, and then the position of the verb, and then the ikke, and then the lettsetning, and then the adjectives which have to change, and you're like, no, I can't do this. And you are right, it is borderline impossible to be doing this, like really to be recalling these rules and then putting words in them and conjugating the words and declining them and doing all these things and keeping an eye on the word order. It is borderline impossible to be doing it. So you have to go by the phrase level as well. While understanding the grammar, you also have to be able to identify these functional units and learn them, practice them, as if those were your vocabulary items, not just isolated words, right? But these. And we do this to a certain extent, but we have to realize that anything is a phrase. If we take verbs synes and tror. Synes and tror are a good case in point. This is called grammar in most textbooks when it actually is more about the meaning, so it's more like vocabulary. But all of us know the difference, but it's borderline impossible to be evaluating those situations when also speaking. But if we learn some phrases, so for example, synes is really common with modal verbs like bør or skal. And we have phrases like jeg syns at vi bør, jeg syns at du skal. So if you learn this as a package, because bør and skal mean that you should do it, and if you should do something, then that's clearly my opinion. So when I want to recommend you something based on maybe my experience with similar things, I know about your situation and I have an opinion, and I really think you should do it, then it's like, jeg syns at du skal gjøre det og det. The line is very fine between believing and having an opinion, right? So evaluating this in real time, for example, is borderline impossible, but you can think, jeg syns at du skal. Okay, jeg syns at du skal. This is something to learn, right? This is the unit, and this is how kids learn to speak. They register that, there is something, which is jeg syns at du skal. And that's how they then speak. They pick it up from their input and they speak. We as adults have the advantage that we can understand it through some explanation that we read in a book, or that a teacher gives us, or that we find somewhere on YouTube, right? And this makes us go quicker, because to register everything from our input can take a long time. And as adults, when we reach something like B1, we typically stop progressing if we just consume input. We keep progressing in vocabulary, but we still make the same mistakes. And this is called the okay plateau. Yeah, so we have reached an okay level. We can do something with our Norwegian, but we are not progressing the way we want to be progressing. When the grammar is as complicated as Norwegian grammar is, then the strategy of putting words into grammar structures totally crashes.